Hello, this is John Majori with Majori on Bowie, and this is the Majori on Bowie YouTube channel, where I have a new interview every week that always has something to do with David Bowie. And for daily content, visit the blog www.majorionbowie.com for new content every single day that almost always has something to do with David Bowie. And today, I'm very excited to welcome Simon Jacobs as my guest. Simon is a critically acclaimed fiction writer, prominent within independent and experimental literary circles. His book, Saturn, reissued in a 10-year anniversary edition last year by Long Day Press, has been described as a cult classic. The book, a collection of surreal, inventive short stories, all orbit around David Bowie. The title of the book is a reference to Saturn, also known as Kronos, the Titan thought to be depicted in this painting by Goya, and is associated with time, decay, and eating his own children. The painting is mentioned in two of the stories. But Saturn is not the central figure here. It is David Bowie, though I think it would be inaccurate to say that the stories are strictly about David Bowie. Rather, Simon uses a fictionalized Bowie to explore a variety of topics. At least that's how I read it. But hey, we have the author here himself, so let's ask him. But before we do, I should note that in addition to Saturn, Simon Jacobs is the author of the novels Stringfellow and Palaces and the story collection Masterworks. So welcome, Simon.
Thank you. I'm excited to talk with you about this weird book and all things David Bowie.
Yeah, I'm excited to have the conversation. So let me say on the outset that I'm always reluctant to characterize a writer's work, which I just did. So I wanted to paint the broadest possible picture, but really ask you, what is the book about? What are the stories about in your words?
Yeah, and I guess in my words, the way that I describe Saturn is a fictional latter-day biography of David Bowie, basically. Because
Yeah.
that's sort of the premise from which I wrote, a lot of the stories, which, do tilt towards surreal or weird. But, fundamentally, when I started writing these stories, it came from sort of like, what is David Bowie up to these days? And this is the particular approach that I took to explore that question.
So did you start writing these stories when he was in his period of hiatus?
Exactly, yeah. So I started, I think I started writing these stories as early as probably like 2010 or 2011. I was in college at the time and I was writing, like that was the period in my life when I started, writing and getting writing and publishing short fiction. And at the time I was really into writing, what they call flash fiction, which is basically just like very short pieces of fiction, often just a few hundred words. It's a really constrained format and a good way to explore different like tones and styles and stuff. And I was really into David Bowie and, as I had been for a long time. And, I was reading a lot of experimental short fiction. And, I really loved the idea of approaching David Bowie like as a character, and particularly like because no one had heard from him, since 2004. So I was like, my interpretation is as good as anyone's. So this is like a fertile space for me to imagine.
Yeah, and
Uh,
and you do imagine because it's there was a point that I was reading it where the scenarios they're not just fictionalized, they sort of defy physics or reality as most of us interact with it. But you're not just
right.
using the name. I mean, you're making reference to his family and his work, and I think some of the themes that you cover are actually parallel some of the themes of his own later writing, his later albums. Um, is that fair to say?
Yeah, that was the intent. The intent
Yeah.
was that like for it, while I've put David Bowie in like surreal situations, the idea was that you could go back and fact check a lot of the like minute details and find that they were correct or like came from some, from some existing Bowie lore. Like much as I imagine you as a, comprehensive David Bowie fan, you are probably also a fan of the complete David Bowie by Nicholas Pegg that,
Yeah,
are you
I
about to
haven't.
pull it up? I've also got a copy behind me
It's
if you don't.
invisible against the screen, but
Oh, there you go.
I have it next to my desk.
I think you've got one edition more advanced. Mine has the reality era David Bowie on the cover. So I'm not fully up to date. But I so I've read all the biography. I've read a bunch of biographies. I've read that book probably cover to cover, like it was like bedside reading because it's just fun to go in and dip for David Bowie facts. And so, I had all this like trivia in my head and this like so I tried to like keep while again while I'm putting David Bowie in like weird spaces, I tried to keep like a lot of the facts and stuff like very anchored to reality, uh so that it like while it might feel weird and trippy, it also felt like, well, sure, why not, like this could be what's going on.
Yeah. Is so it is your Bowie a happy person?
So it does, like, so honestly, I feel like so as we could as we could talk about either now or later, like this book has had a long life.
Yeah.
So it started, I would say that David Bowie as a person in Saturn has gotten happier as time has gone on
Okay.
and the book has expanded. It was first published in 2014, so basically like I think like right after the next day came out, because he sort of like popped out with that album right when I was in the midst of sort of turning these stories into a book. And so I was like, oh shit, well, what do I like? Does this subvert my project? Because the premise is like, this could be what David Bowie's doing, but we know what he's doing now. He's releasing this album. So anyway, like I think the initial version that was published in 2014 was, it ended on the story David Bowie devouring his son. So he was like, it was more, the overall thrust of it, he was more sort of not self-obsessed exactly, but a little bit self-obsessed with like his own legacy and his image, et cetera, et cetera. But then, so that came out in 2014. And then when he died in 2016, I was like, this doesn't, it didn't land as well for me, with the rest of his legacy. So at that point, I revisited it and added, what is now the last story and, gave it a gentler landing.
Yeah.
And then, now
Gentler than him devouring his son.
gentler than him devouring his son. The devouring of his son is less literal, I think, in
Yeah.
the in subsequent editions of the book. And then in 2023 or 2024, when we revisited it again in honor of the 10th anniversary, I was looking to add a little bit more texture there too, and I added and I added two more stories to it, sort of woven within that are gentler, I would
Yeah.
say. And so I think as a result, like David Bowie, to go back to your question, is David Bowie happy in this book? I would say in the first edition, he was not happy, and he was consistently unhappy throughout the entire book. In the second edition, he reached a level of peace and acceptance. And then, I think the edition as it exists now is more sort of elegiac and he's more, yeah, at peace, I think.
Yeah.
Still considering what his legacy, his artistic past, but um, but more but less obsessively.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you coincidentally released this when The Next Day came out. But if you think about the cover of The Next Day, he has defaced himself, right? He has
Yep.
defaced an
Yep.
image of his own album, Heroes. And it's almost as if you were working in tandem with him.
I know.
Yeah.
There was a lot of spooky, like that video for Where Are We Now? I
Yeah.
was like, this could have been in the book. Like, projecting the like Tony Ausler like images of himself onto like a puppet. Like it ended up feeling, and even when Blackstar came out too, it was like it really ended up feeling of a piece with the book as it was. And I felt like I feel like this is like spiritually aligned to David Bowie, and that there are all these little unexpected overlaps with the new work that he's releasing and where this book is going. So it's been fun to, I don't know, it's just fun to like anytime I learn something new about David Bowie or hear new stuff, like think about it in context of like this project.
Yeah. Yeah. As I was reading, they're very short stories. If you're watching this and you haven't read the book yet, they're very short stories. Yet I had emotional reactions to several of them, and I'll tell you the one that I had the most emotional reaction to, and I think it's not the one where he devours his son, but it is related, where he's congratulating his son on a movie premiere.
David Bowie attends the premiere of his son's latest film. For a brief moment, they inhabit the same coast. In the film, Jake Gyllenhaal is forced to repeatedly relive the last 8 minutes in the life of a random stranger on a Chicago-bound train, attempting to prevent the bombing that kills everyone aboard. Its themes are as familiar to David Bowie as breathing, as family, and as they stand facing each other upon the stairs outside the theater, he recalls other origins, on the birth of his daughter Lexi, now on the cusp of her teenage years. The doctor had told David Bowie that it appeared as though he'd given her his entire gene pool. Likewise, the resemblance between him and his son, BAFTA-winning filmmaker Duncan Jones, has always been uncanny. And looking at him now, it is difficult to see anything other than a younger version of himself, a version without children. David Bowie feels something welling up inside of him, the terror of one who looks so much like his past. They embrace, while camera flashes surround them, and suddenly his voice sounds hollow. He speaks into his eyes, but all at once, David Bowie is relating in nothing but esoteric cliches, in lines he wrote 40 years ago. Don't believe in yourself, he intones. Knowledge comes with death's release. Lines that have always been about potential. He laughed. He shook his hand. When the photos are developed, however, upon further inspection, it will appear as though father and son aren't actually touching, but orbiting each other a hair's breadth apart. Looking even closer, it will start to seem as if David Bowie isn't there at all.
Premiere. And he, at the end of the story, which again is not long, he's hugging Duncan Jones, and then there's this, upon closer examination, the picture of him hugging his son, they're not actually touching, and upon closer examination still, he's not even there. And and rather than him being devoured by his son, or I'm sorry, rather than him devouring his son, I felt like he was never there to begin with. It's like his time is gone. What is memory? What is illusion? Were any of us ever here? Was there a real David Bowie? What was going through your mind when you're writing this?
Well, actually, to go back to that specific example, I'm paging through my copier to remind myself. But so that is an example of Yeah, so the story is David Bowie attends the premiere of his son's latest film, is the one that you just referenced, which I think that the movie that I'm referring to, I think is Source Code. Is that what it's called? It's the one that came after Moon. So that's an example of one of these stories there, where I took the real, it's timed around the actual movie, includes stuff from, it's like time and date appropriate to when that movie came out. But then but notably, David Bowie did not go to the premiere of that movie.
Uh-huh.
So, I was able to take, I knew he wasn't there, but I was able to like stage a story as if he was there, but then like connect it to reality, but in an emotional way because he wasn't there.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's an example of one of those like, things where I took like a fact that I learned and just
Yeah.
like was able to like put it into the narrative like somewhere in a way that fit the what I was trying to do emotionally with like the story. Um, but
Tell
I
me if
guess I did not answer your question though. So
let me sort of ask it in a different way. Which is not exactly the same question, but am I reading too much into it to think that? Well, let me sort of back up. You're writing about David Bowie, but as you know, is the case with any good fiction, the character is also a stand-in for the reader. If I can't relate to a character, I'm not going to want to read. And I felt like that particular story was almost about a son's stepping out of his father's shadow.
mhm.
And I was thinking of Lexi Jones recently released a poem titled David Bowie's Daughter, and it was about,
Oh, interesting.
yeah, it was sort of her attempt to, hey, my father was great, but I'm my own person. And I kind of, that maybe was in the back of my head when I was reading your story, because
Hmm.
it's like,
Hmm.
this is a story about Duncan Jones and his accomplishment. And he goes within just, you know, a few hundred words from being David Bowie's son to being the creator of this movie, right? Where David Bowie isn't even there, it has nothing to do with David Bowie.
Hmm. Hmm.
Am I
Hmm.
reading too much into that?
No, no, not at all. Because I think that, like at its core, it's like the book is about, an aging artist like thinking about his work and his family and his impact and his death. And it's sort of like, but then it's decorated with David Bowie trivia.
Yeah,
That's what makes it like fun and unique and surreal and interesting. So yeah, the goal was definitely to, explore some of these emotional themes through this like kind of canted lens that I happen to know a lot about, which is David
yeah,
Bowie. So absolutely, I think that reading is
yeah.
is spot on for sure.
But you didn't title the collection Source Code, you titled it Saturn, which also has to do with the father's relationship with his son.
Yeah, yep, yep.
So why did you initially end the initial compilation with that story? And I've got some thoughts, but what was that all about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, because I had been like, so the story that ends the book, David Bowie devouring his son, is, as you mentioned at the beginning, based on the painting Saturn Devouring His Son by Goya, who is part of a series of paintings that Goya made like late in his life when he was like deaf and like kind of blind, and he like painted them on on like the walls of his like home. Like it's a very tortured like series of, these very kind of occult and like cosmic themes,
Yeah,
around like death and aging and apocalypse and religion, basically. So, I love that series of paintings. I liked, I was sort of like wanted to tie that in. I can't remember if there are any explicit, now that I think of it, if there are explicit David Bowie and Goya connections. I'm sure that there are. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I was into them at the time, and I was like, there were a lot of thematic resonances with like what I imagine, with how at the time I was like, this vision that I had made of David Bowie, in the time since his last public appearance, where he's, who knows what he's doing, but in my version of the story, he's just like, uh flailing, crashing
Yeah.
out. And I mean, I wrote so I liked the idea of like the story originally ending with this like intense act of like, consuming his own legacy in like a literal way, because he's been like obsessed with it throughout the book. And the book is full of all these like, you know, really like trivial like allusions to David Bowie like arcana, and it just felt very satisfying to me to be like have it be like a serpent eating its tail sort of
Yeah.
at the end, where now he's become the like god of time, and he's like devouring his own son so that there will not be any beyond him. And so it was a dark place, but I thought, I mean, I was 22 years old, so I was like, it fit with the mode that I was writing in at the time. And much as I have over the last 10 years, I've got, given the world a little bit more slack, I suppose.
Isn't that funny? It's like, when we're 20, we're really sort of down on the world, and then when we're older, we're like, yeah, not so bad.
Yeah, yeah. I've
So
gotten inured to it.
yeah, but there's in preparation for talking to you, I did a little research into the painting, which I was aware of, but I'd never really studied or read much about. And there's two things that stood out to me that I thought were relevant. The one, which I already knew, was Saturn was Kronos. So the Greek Kronos was the Greek name for this god, as you said, associated with time. And time and decay were themes that Bowie addressed throughout his whole career. And you write a lot about later stage Bowie, but an example that I think many fans can think of is the song Time from 1973, right? So he was pretty young when he wrote that. And time is never a friend for David Bowie. It's always,
true.
Decay. And that's an association with Kronos. But the other thing that I didn't know was Goya did not name the painting or even identify what it was. The title was given to it by later interpreters. So we don't actually know for sure what Goya had intended. And that what I thought of was David Bowie is not real, right? It's a made up name. And he was inconsistent in describing the meaning of his own work, but he really invited his audience to bring their own meaning to it. And I don't know what the question is here, but am I reading too much into it?
I don't think so. I will say that I did not know that about the Goya painting. Or, it's possible I knew that 10 years ago or 12 years ago or whatever when I wrote that story originally. But I give you more credit than I give myself of 12 years ago. So I don't think it's too much to read that into it, but I really like that observation. That's a very cool like alignment.
Yeah.
Wow, interesting.
Not to get sidetracked, but one of the sort of the concepts that I think about when I write about Bowie is he never changed his name to David Bowie. So his legal name was always David Jones. He signed documents that way. And so David Bowie was sort of a meta character. And I've sometimes wonder if like somebody else could play David Bowie. Would somebody else have the same legitimacy?
Yep.
And so if that's the case, did David Bowie ever not? Did David Bowie ever really exist?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I think he did a lot to sort of cultivate the fact, like especially in his like, from the, I don't know, probably from like the 80s on as he was like becoming more and more famous. But I feel like, there was a lot to, he never really let people into his personal life or whatever. Like I feel like he did see there was a pretty strong barrier that he put up between his like artistic persona and like his life as as like a family man and like as a New Yorker or and yeah, his like day to day. So
Yeah,
I could imagine that is that David Bowie was like, yeah, a mask that David Jones wore when needed. um yeah, so I definitely, yeah, I totally agree with you.
yeah,
And I, it's like yeah, what a fascinating thought. Like, could someone pick up the David Bowie, mantle such as it is? And I feel it seems like that was certainly probably a question that he considered at some point in his life, if I had to guess. Even if the answer was, a decided no, for example, I feel like it was probably, you know, like I feel almost certain that he thought about it.
it's
But
the lyrics in Blackstar. Um,
yeah, somebody took his place.
yeah,
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's been yeah, I don't know. Maybe they're waiting to reveal themselves, but I guess we're coming up on, it was about 10 years between the reality tour and, or I guess it was 10 years between reality and the next day, because the next day was 2013,
right.
right?
Yeah, that's right.
So maybe in 2026, 10 years after Blackstar, we'll get the next Bowie
Yeah.
in some
It,
form or fashion.
from I again, my perspective is skewed because I write about David Bowie every day. But it seems to me that there's more interest in David Bowie today than
Mm,
um, you know, not during his entire life, but say 20 years ago, when he was still
mhm.
around. Do you do you think that, or why, do you think that?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I mean, I have, like you, I have a pretty skewed perspective because I've been an obsessive David Bowie fan like since I was like a teenager. Um, so I honestly like, but I get this, when I started being a fan of David Bowie, which was like in the like early 2000s, like it was probably like right around, like right after, it was definitely in his hiatus. I feel like it was probably in like 2004 or something like that when I was like 13 or 14. And so it was like after, it was in the hiatus, and then I was just sort of discovering everything and working my way backwards. And I did not get the sense, I mean, again, I was not a normal teenager, but I mean, as far as I knew, but like, not what my peers were doing. So, um, but then I definitely felt like when, Black Star came out, not really the next day, but like when Black Star came out, then he was sort of like back in the public
Yeah,
consciousness. Probably like, I mean, his death obviously had something to do with that. But I feel like there's been a staying power because of the strength of Black Star, honestly, like a staying power in the public consciousness that I just don't think would have been there if his last album had been The Next Day or his last
yeah,
album had been Reality. Like I feel like Black Star is just like just a really just such a unique, like, you know, creation that it like is maybe like not single-handedly responsible, but like is a really important anchor point for like where, public perception of David Bowie is now, 9 years later. I don't know. Do you agree?
Well, the answer to that question is yes. And my hesitation was I was going to ask you another question, but now you know that I agree with that. But it if Blackstar was his last album, but he was still alive, I don't know that that would be the case.
I agree. His death is an important part of that. It's like, probably a disappointingly big part of that,
Yeah.
Because I
But
would
the
love more
point,
David Bowie music.
right? Yeah, I would take it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But
Exactly.
what I was going to ask was a now obsolete question. Do you think that's because of the quality of the music of the album Blackstar, or the total circumstances of Blackstar, or both?
Yeah. I think it's both. There's just like it is unquestionably like an incredible album. And the fact that and honestly the fact that it is like so, you know, knotted up with his death and it's like secrecy until its release is just like, sort of like makes it all the more like you almost like because I feel like because it came out like and then a couple days after we heard that he died, right?
Right.
So you could, I don't know if you did you, I don't know if you had this experience, but when you listen to that, I don't know if you think back to when you first listened to that album,
Yeah.
it really feels like David Bowie saying goodbye, especially when you like, with like the I can't give everything away. And, you have that like echo to like a new career in a new town. It really, I feel like in those when the first experience of listening to that album is really like was really something that can't be captured like between when it came out and when he died. um and but so I do feel like that album is like a message in some way, but then it is also just like an incredible album. Like he did there what David Bowie has always been so good at, which is like, you know, finding like finding incredible talent, letting them do their thing, under the like under his like creative vision. His best albums are all, I feel like, collaborative in that way, where it's not David Bowie playing every instrument, and he's sort of letting people lean into their strengths and finding like cool and weird things for them to do to like showcase their talent. Like it makes total sense to me that David Bowie's last album is this like, very intimate, like experimental jazz album that, came about because of his like, deeply ingrained like routines in the fabric of New York, where he like sees these guys perform and he's like, that's what I'm doing next. Like, and they turn it into something weird and wonderful. In the same way that, around the same time when there was they did like the Lazarus play musical,
Yeah.
at around the same time, it's like, yeah, he was never going to go back and do a tour where he did all of his greatest hits again. The only like retrospective that David Bowie would like allow was like, let's do an experimental musical with like picking up on a character from like 40 years ago. And I'm not going to sing any of the songs, but I'm going to like, do some like reinterpretations and yeah, I'm going to do my retrospective at this like medium-sized theater in New York. It'll run for a couple of weeks. It'll like run for a couple of months. And, maybe we'll release a cast album. But like, I'm not gonna make, $40 million off of this. So I just like those, yeah, the last artistic act of David Bowie is just like such a
Yeah.
cool thing.
So, especially now that I'm talking with you, but I also got the impression from the book that you appreciated, you were a fan of Bowie's later works. And there's a reference, for instance, to Heathen that I don't have it in front of me, but it was a very laudatory reference to the album Heathen, which I also think is a great album that
Yeah.
kind of gets underappreciated.
Yep.
But I got the sense that your character, your Bowie, was almost dismissive of his later works because he's just thinking about his earlier works.
Yeah.
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 What is that about, especially if you yourself are not dismissive of his later works?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's speaking to like the version of David Bowie that I wrote, who is like sort of obsessively looking towards the past rather than like the future. And because it is him sort of like, yeah, nostalgically, I don't know if that's the right word, but looking back on, his previous albums rather than the ones that he's just, put
Yeah.
in the can and released. So that's a good question. Maybe it has something to do, that era. I think part of the reason that I was more, I was interested in latter day David Bowie was because A, there was just nobody knew anything about him now since his hiatus. But B, there's just like so much stuff about 70s and 80s David Bowie. It just was like not interesting to me.
Yeah.
And so I was like, there's much more, it's more fun to me to think of an artist who's, you know, at the time, like a little bit past his prime and, sort of thinking about his life holistically and looking back. There's like just so much fun stuff to, to make interesting writing out of. Like it's a very deep mine.
Yeah.
And so, but I love his, like I feel like I listen to, post Scary Monsters Bowie way more than pre Scary Monsters Bowie these days. And I think that reflects a little bit like, hey, I do really love those new albums, but those were also like when I was a kid, those were the weirdly like some of the first ones that I listened to. Um, when I grew up, I learned about David Bowie because we had that like best of Bowie
Yeah.
CD that we listened to all the time. And then when I, was when I had, some pocket money and was started to like buy music for myself, one of the first things I bought was like this, in retrospect, not very good, like 10 CD box set of David Bowie's like five at the time, last five albums. It was like a box set that had Outside, Earthling, Hours, Heathen, and Reality. And I did not know that this was like late period David Bowie. I didn't really know where it came from. I was just like, wow, 10 CDs of David Bowie. Like, this is going to be great. And I listened to it and I was like, where the hell are all the songs that I know? Like, literally the only one that's on there that was in Best of Bowie was I'm Afraid of Americans. And I was like, this isn't even the right version because because the single version is the Trent Reznor remix. But because I was, a 13-year-old with a Walkman, like that's what I listened to for like a really long time. So, one of my early first favorite David Bowie songs was Bring Me the Disco King. Like I love
Yeah.
that song. But yeah, so there was like one I'm sure I still have that somewhere, but there was like disc one was the album, and then disc two was just like a bunch of like terrible remixes that were like all way too long. Not a great box set, in my opinion, but anyway. So yeah, I don't know. Again, a long-winded and oblique answer to your question, but there we are.
You know what's I find interesting about that long answer is I've often wondered if there wasn't the David Bowie from 1969 to 1983, if that David Bowie didn't exist, and his first album was, I don't know, take your pick, Tonight, or start with something a little bit better received, Black Tie, White Noise, let's say, would we know who he is, right?
Yeah.
Like Black Tie, White Noise, you know, probably is very few people's very favorite album of David Bowie, but it's also, you know, usually doesn't end up on the bottom of the list.
Right.
So it's good, right? But would we even know who he was if that was his first album?
Yeah, yeah. It's so interesting. I feel like, you know, some people would, but I think that like for me, like one of the things that I love about David Bowie, like I love the music, but like I also love the transformations, the tonal shifts.
Yeah.
I love the diversity of the catalog. That's part and parcel of the David Bowie experience for me. It's not just his music, but it's also his art and also his writing. It's his like and his like weird internet startup, and it's like it's to his financial crimes or not, I don't know, whatever Bowie bonds or whatever are. But it's just like, it's the breadth and depth of his catalog and his like willingness to experiment and, occasionally throw it all away. So I think if you put the quality of the music totally aside, if you did pick up with Black Tie, White Noise, it would just be it, you would lose a lot of that, like, yeah, you would lose a big chunk of that restless creativity
Yeah.
and all of the different, collaboration and artwork that it created, which I think is sort of part of what makes David Bowie really cool, is his longevity and that experimentation over, you know, 50 plus years.
Yeah. I've often thought that David Bowie is the one artist that I could think of who gave the audience what they don't want.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's a reason for
Not
that.
based on market research, he wasn't like, what do the fans want to hear next? Like,
Yeah. No, I mean, absolutely not that, but also, there's a world in which he's still alive today and he's still doing Ziggy, and it's just right.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and that's like, and again, it like, that wouldn't water down the quality of some of that early career stuff, but it would make him so much less interesting as an artist, So I totally agree.
So I want, you've been terrific with giving me all this time. I have a couple of random questions that I want to ask. I don't want to lose sight of. So throughout the book, throughout the stories, you only refer to David Bowie as David Bowie. You never say Bowie, you never say David or anything else. And whenever you mention Iman, you always put parenthetically that he wrote songs for her. Sometimes you add to that description, but you always say it. So what were you doing there?
So this came, it's part of the, like, some of my fun tonal experiments for this. So I think that so as I mentioned, I started writing these stories in college. And I was engaging at the time with a lot of different, modes of writing, like, other stuff, that short fiction that I was reading, again, that like really played with like the style and tone of, yeah, with style and tone. But I was also like in college, so I was getting my first taste of like scholarly reading, like scholarly writing and things. And so my like, and like, so reading like, yeah, just like academic writing and like art criticism and stuff, which like has a real cadence to it and like a jargon and, can be repetitive. And so originally, like when I started writing these, they were really, the first one I think that I wrote was the David Lynch one, which is the shortest. Yeah, David Bowie watches his own cameo in a David Lynch movie, which is 2 paragraphs long. It's probably like 200 words. And the idea in my head is I was imagining these as like something you would almost read on like a gallery label in a museum,
Yeah.
where it's just like has these like allusions to different artistic movements and things, and you're like, I don't know what that is, I don't know what that is, I don't know what that like it. There's a lot of like assumed like context and knowledge when you like read like an art history, blurb or something like on a painting. And so I was sort of envisioning it in that mode as like something you might read like if you went to a gallery, because I thought that was very like in keeping with the like, what does David Bowie do these days? Oh, well, he just like buys modern British art and like reads books. And so I thought the like sort of, the yeah, that like sort of scholarly kind of academic, like a little bit like self-referential and like a little satirical tone would like fit the nature of these stories well. And I think it works better for some stories than others. But yeah, that's where it came from.
Yeah.
And or like, yeah, like the kind of name dropping and allusions that you get in that
Yeah.
world.
The David Lynch story is not the shortest.
Oh, it's not oh no, I guess you're right. Yeah,
David Bowie in a Baconian nightmare is the
yeah,
shortest.
yeah, that's the shortest. That's only one
There's one
sentence.
sentence.
Yeah. That's a good point.
See, I read your book.
Yeah, well done.
So to that end, do you know? I mean, you started writing these not as a book, but as they. I
Right.
think the first several of them were published elsewhere. Do you know if he read any of them?
No, I don't know. So when it first was published, I wrote to, is his name Mark Adams? He like ran Bowie.net for a long time. His email was like total blam blam at like davidbowie.com or something. Um, but I wrote to him and he was like, yeah, send me. And I was like, I wrote these stories, like, can I send you some copies? And he was like, yeah, send me some copies. And then he said, I will forward one to DB. And that was where it ended. I never heard, I sent a bunch of copies overseas. I don't know where they went from there, but I like to imagine that
Yeah.
he got his hands on the book. I don't think he was, he was probably selectively deaf to like what people, wrote about him. And, it's basically fan fiction. There's plenty of that out there. But I like to think maybe he read it somewhere.
Yeah. Well, it's too bad he never got back to you.
Yeah. I didn't get it was like on Bowie. Were you ever a member of Bowie Net?
Yes.
Yeah. So he would sign his posts like Sailor, right?
Yeah.
That was his. I never got an email or a message from Sailor
Yeah.
or anything, but
I think when I was on it, when I was on it, I was not writing about David Bowie. I was just a fan, and
by the time, yeah, it had long shuttered by
yeah,
then.
I don't think that I was even cognizant that he would go on as Sailor then. So as far as I know, I was having conversations with him unknowingly.
Yeah, that's fun.
But so
Yeah.
this sort of brings me to something else. So I think that if somebody's watching this interview, they're a David Bowie fan. And when I was starting to write the blog, I came to realize that there's this international David Bowie sort of subculture, which is sort of amazing that it exists. So some
Indeed.
people that are watching this are they've read this, your book, they maybe read the stories when they're initially published elsewhere, and they're really excited to see that I'm interviewing you. Well, this is finally we get to see what Simon looks like. So, but there's others that will be learning about it for the first time. But in researching you, what I kind of came to realize is there is an independent literature sort of, I don't know if it's fair to say, subculture, where you've got a pretty solid fan base, but it's sort of operating under the surface of like the Times review of books or something like that. And I'm wondering how much of that is strategic on your part. Do you feel sort of unrestrained in being so prominent in like the independent literature circle, or is it not something you think about?
I think it's something that I've like. So I've had, I've published, I don't remember, I think four or five, four-ish books. I don't remember. But and that have been with a mix of like, really, really small publishers to larger ones. And I think like there's, to your point, there's absolutely like, an amazing scene out there of independent publishers. And, honestly, that's most of what I read, I feel like comes from independent publishers. And that's where I published a lot of my, my writing is in, online literary magazines or like, in like journals and stuff like that. And so, what I found is, I think it sort of, I've tried to find the publisher, as I've been working on different books, I've tried to find the publisher that I feel like resonates best with the material. Like, so Spork Press were the original publishers of Saturn, and there were this is let's see if I can get it to show up. This is the first edition of the book from 2014, where they were a ruthlessly like DIY outfit in Tucson, who created these like beautifully like hand bound and like letterpress stamped books. And I got the reason I got in touch with them was just because I'd read a bunch of their books and I really loved them. And that's how I found the publisher for my first novel as well. $2 Radio, like I'm from Ohio, and $2 Radio is a Columbus-based independent publisher. They were probably the first independent publisher whose books I recognized and read. And so I've really just tried to follow the path of like finding a publisher whose other work I really love and respect, and where I could like where it would be fun to have like label mates that are other like writers that I respect and admire. So it's been a fun journey, and I'm really really grateful to Spork and to who put out multiple editions of the book, who were like, is I was working with Bowie fans, probably definitely more strongly opinionated than I am. Like I think I was spared some of like what one of the editors like strongest opinions were for some versions of Saturn. Like I think he really didn't like what I was doing in some cases and really did in others. And ultimately he liked the overall picture. but so and then I'm really grateful to Spork and then Josh Bonsack at Long Day Press, who put out the new edition. I could not have asked for like a better group of folks to like keep it, to like basically volunteer to like keep it in print and get it back into print. Like, it's just really cool to me that people are invested in helping some of this work like be out and available to people again, because that's the problem you run into with when you publish things independently, is a lot of independent presses close, or they're people get drawn artistically elsewhere. So I'm really glad to have it back in print. Like, it's a real honor to have people like yourself be able to discover this book anew. So I'm really grateful for that. And and that's, I don't know, that's something that doesn't exist in like corporate publishing, really. Like, I don't know, that comes from the kind of DIY side of things.
Well, I'm very grateful for David Bowie leading me to you. So now I'm going to read more of your material.
Likewise. Yeah, likewise.
Simon, I'm so happy to have met you and to have had this conversation. I close all my interviews with the same question, which is silly, but I'm going to ask you, which is, what is your favorite Bowie song and album?
So I think song, I'm going to say Teenage Wildlife. I'm really going to try to not waffle on my answers. So song, I'm going to say Teenage Wildlife. Album, I think my favorite album has changed. It evolved as I age as a person. But here and now, based on our previous conversation, I'm going to say Blackstar.
Nice.
What about you?
What about me? So my favorite Bowie album has been the same for a long time, which is Scary Monsters. And so I feel very comfortable saying that.
Yep.
Favorite
it's
song
proven itself in in its longevity.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
That's my second answer. The answer I almost gave.
Yeah. I'm very partial to Blackstar as well. I would put that in my top 5, but 2 through 5 shifts every day.
Yeah.
My favorite song, I have long said, is Beauty and the Beast, which is the opening song off of Heroes. I think in reality, the last several years, I've listened to Sweet Thing, Candidate Sweet Thing more, and have sort of contemplated it more. It was sort of helped me through 2020 and 2021. So as a, my sort of brand loyalty is to Beauty and the Beast, but observationally, my favorite song might be that.
Yeah. And the vocal performance is so cool on that one, and unique. And he like goes way up and way down. It's got so many good lines. The Beauty and the Beast is that's a really good choice too.
Yeah.
My second choice was 5 years.
Yeah. There's so much to choose from.
Yeah, exactly. That's why we're having this conversation.
Yeah. Well, Simon, thank you. My mind is already firing off about an excuse to talk with you again.
I'll talk about David Bowie anytime.
Well, I'll
scheduled
invite you
or
back.
unscheduled.
Yeah. I certainly hope we stay in touch. But thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks, John.